Story time!
Warning: contains adult content including harsh language, violence, and sexual themes, and may not be suitable for people under age 17.
I Fell in Love with a Murderer. Read to you and written by Kara Reynolds. Deep inside a small town in Japan, a small rickety house stood behind a fence and a feeble gate. The house was so silent it made you feel as if something was terribly wrong. It was a dark night and the wind was slightly heavier than it normally got. Someone had walked past the house just moments ago, froze, and ran to the nearest payphone, for there were screams and the sounds of breaking glass and cracking furniture. Inside the house, a 17-year-old boy with long, messy black hair stood in the middle of the room, staring at the floor. He was holding a knife that was dripping blood onto the already heavily blood-stained carpet. His mother was dead, his father was dead, and his 13-year-old sister was, well, dead. Each body was horribly disfigured. The mother had been gutted, her intestines and what looked like a smashed bloody mass of an organ laying on the floor next to her. The father's eyes had been punctured, his throat slit, and had many other wounds all over his body. The girl, his sister, was missing her head. The boy looked up as he heard sirens outside the house. Quick like a cat, he slipped the knife into the pocket of his hooded jacket and ran out the back door, where he was able to take a short path into the woods completely unseen. The boy ran, tearing his jacket and jeans on the branches that were keen on grabbing him to pull him back to the scene of his dead family. He did not discard the murder weapon, but in fact held onto it tight, making sure it didn't fall out of his pocket. He tripped over a fallen branch and landed face first into the dirt and soggy leaves. He swore loudly, glaring at the branch as if it had done it on purpose. He stood with difficulty, his ankle throbbing with pain where the branch had caught him. He figured he was far enough now. He couldn't hear sirens or voices from behind. He walked on, knowing he wouldn't get lost, for he knew these woods better than anyone alive. A pretty girl of about 20 strode in broad daylight through the streets of a city that was neighboring 2 cities next to the town where the first mysterious murder occurred. It had been 3 years since the police had found the Sakura family dead and the son missing. The way the police had described it, it seemed as if there was a terrible struggle in the boys' room, and no possessions had been taken, but broken, as if there was a fight within. Chunks of the boy's hair had been found on the floor, as if it had been torn out, and a few drops of blood stained the carpet, suggesting a broken nose from the victim. In the living room, the other 3 members were brutally murdered, blood stains decorating the floors and walls. "We believe the suspect kidnapped the boy and killed the family before running off," the chief of police had said. "There was no murder weapon and no DNA of a 5th person being inside the home. Whoever the murderer was, he was very careful not to leave any evidence against him." They had searched for the teenage boy for a year, as well as investigated many more brutal murders committed in this same town, again with no evidence that the murderer had even been there. By the end of the year, the police had discovered fragments of the boy's clothing sitting on a muddy bank of a river. A search was done, but they concluded that a year's worth of water damage and the force of the current surely had torn the body to fragments and carried them to the ocean. They presumed him dead. Meanwhile, the murderer had moved to the next city, where a horrific number of murders were committed, all in the same fashion. Absolutely no evidence. However, there were no longer any reports of missing people like there was with the Sakura boy. And then he moved to the next city, and then the next. 3 years of mysterious homicide over 4 different areas, and absolutely no leads. The pretty girl was walking home from work, carrying a plastic bag which she held behind her, thinking absent-mindedly to herself. She had short hair that framed her face perfectly, falling just past her chin, and it had been bleached to a slightly orange color of blonde, a 1/4 of an inch of her natural black hair growing in at the roots. She was a curvy girl, and had pleasantly pale skin and amber eyes. She walked along the street, her feet carrying her down the familiar path to home. I wish I didn't have to walk home from work alone, she thought, as her feet suddenly made her turn towards a different route she never took, but she was too deep in thought to notice. All of these mysterious murders are so frightening. I'm afraid I'll run into the guy responsible one day. She was now walking down an alley. Realizing this, she frowned. I guess I wasn't paying attention. I'll be fine. This way is faster. She quickened her pace, but something dark caught her eye as she walked past it. She froze and turned to see what the lump on the ground was. A young man with torn, dirty clothes was curled up in a ball against the brick wall of the alley. His eyes were closed, his lips parted slightly, and his face was spattered with blood. The girl shrieked, backing away and dropping the plastic bag she held. "Dead!" she screamed. "He's dead!" The man jerked awake and jumped, staring at the girl with a bewildered expression. She calmed, holding her chest and picking up her bag. "Oh, thank God," she panted, stepping closer to the man. "I thought you had been murdered." The man stared at her, his hand clutching something in his pocket. "You look like you've been attacked. Are you okay?" Yes, the man mumbled. The girl smiled and knelt down close to him. "You need to be careful being on the streets alone," she said, pulling a small rag out of her pocket and wiping some of the blood off of his face. "There's a crazy murderer loose, and no one even knows what he looks like." Distracted, the man let his hand relax, letting go of the item and falling out of his pocket onto the ground. "Do you have a home?" asked the girl. "No," the man said hoarsely. "I'm homeless." The girl gasped and grabbed his hand firmly, pulling him to a standing position. "I am taking you home and getting you cleaned up and fed," she said, very determined. "You look like you haven't had a decent meal in years." She tugged on his hand to continue home, but the man didn't budge. I don't deserve your hospitality." The girl turned and came closer to him once more. "Nonsense," she cooed. "You are so young, and I can tell you are very kind." She furrowed her brow. "My name is Mina Ayasaki," she said, holding out her hand. "Now tell me your name." The man hesitated, and then took her hand slowly. He froze and managed a fake cough quite suddenly. It would not be smart to reveal his last name. Sahashi, he said finally. "I like that name," said Mina with a sweet smile. "Now will you please come home with me so I can feed you?" Kodo stared at her, and then nodded feebly, bowing his head, trying to hide his bloody face with his dark and filthy hair. They didn't pass many people on the way. No one wanted to go outside unaccompanied by someone else, which was ironic because a majority of the murders were committed within the victim's own home. Mina led Kodo to a small apartment building. They walked up the stairs, and Mina unlocked her door and they went inside. "It's not much," she said with a weak laugh, "but it's pretty good for how low the price was." Kodo stared around the tiny apartment. There was a small kitchen, which was very neat and organized, and then there was the living room, which had a very comfy-looking throw on the floor and a television sitting on what looked like a stool. There were 2 other doors, which Kodo assumed were the bathroom and 1 bedroom. "I think it's fantastic," he muttered. Mina gaped at him, and then giggled. "Of course you would," she said. "You probably haven't seen a home for a very long time. Here." She dug into her plastic bag and pulled out a very pretty box. "It's from the bakery where I work. You may eat it if you like. I get to take some of the small cakes home for free, and others I get a very good discount." Kodo opened the box and gaped hungrily. Inside was a small circular chocolate cake fit for 1 person, and a nice red strawberry sitting on a poof of chocolate mousse. Without thinking, Kodo grabbed it and devoured it. The cake was the best thing he ever remembered tasting. Mina laughed, and Kodo froze. I'm so sorry," he mumbled, trying to wipe his mouth. I was just hungry," said Mina. "Stay here." She ran off to her bedroom, kicking off her shoes at the door as she went. Kodo followed suit, but it didn't really matter. His socks were just as dirty as his shoes. Mina came back out, carrying something in her arms. "I don't have any boy clothes," she admitted, handing Kodo the lump she was carrying. but I do have a few pairs of oversized sweatpants and t-shirts that I usually wear to bed. They're not girly or anything." Koto frowned, not used to so much kindness. "You go take a shower, and when you come out, I'll take your clothes to get washed. Go on, it's the door on your left." Koto bowed slightly and found his way to the tiny bathroom. He got undressed, and as his jacket fell to the floor, the knife slipped out of his pocket. It was hard to tell which parts of the blade were rust and which ones were blood. Koto wasn't sure what to do with it, seeing as Mina was going to wash his jacket. There had to be somewhere safe to put it. Koto knelt on the floor, looking around carefully. He spotted a small crevice behind the counter and slid the knife inside, leaving a fraction of the handle sticking out so he could retrieve it when he needed to. He stood and looked at it from every angle. To someone who didn't know it was there, it was completely unnoticeable, for it was mostly concealed by the shadow of the counter. Koto grinned and turned on the water, getting into the shower and cleaning himself properly for the first time in 3 years. Koto got dressed into the clothes that Mina had given him and collected his dirty ones from the floor. He returned to the living room, where he suddenly smelled something wonderful. He had no idea what it was, but he wanted very badly to eat it. He blinked towards the kitchen through his wet hair and saw Mina by the stove. She turned and smiled sweetly. "I thought it was a perfect time to cook dinner. You're still hungry, right?" Koto nodded and placed his clothes on top of his shoes by the door. Mina set up a small, low-to-the-ground foldable wooden table in the middle of the living room and started setting it with plates and bowls. She then set in the center of the table a pot of rice and a bigger pot of some kind of soup with noodles, vegetables, and fish. It had been so long since Koto had had a proper meal, he didn't recognize the soup as udon. He sat on the floor, as did Mina, who started serving herself. "Help yourself, you need it," she said. Koto stared at the steam rising from the soup pot, and then hastily began to serve himself as well. Mina turned on the television while they ate. She had the channel set to the local news station. At the moment they were talking about puppy adoption. Koto stared at the television warily, afraid that they were going to talk about the murders. Just as expected, they did. "Early this morning, police arrived at the scene of yet another local massacre," said an attractive female anchor. "Please say they captured someone," murmured Mina, and Koto held his breath. It was easier to go about his business when he didn't know how far the police had gotten. The house was home to a family of 5, a mother and a father, as well as an elder daughter and 2 sons, one of 11 and the other only 2. Mina covered her mouth at this. There were also many pets inside the house. However, while the family was slain with utter brutality, the 1 dog, 2 cats, and the rabbit were completely unharmed. The dog was found barking in a closet, but nothing had been done to it. The screen switched to a man in a policeman's uniform. "It seems that this criminal is only after human lives," he said. "Usually insane murderers wouldn't care about any animals and slaughter them as well. We seem to be dealing with a man with a bit of a soft spot." It turned to another policeman. "What I don't get is, how can this guy be doing all of this in broad daylight? A lot of these murders have happened in the day, not night." He looked very strained. "And the lack of evidence is unnerving. Not one fingerprint, hair, or skin flake has been discovered that was not from the family who lived there. What's more is, not one person has seen anyone suspicious enter or leave the homes which were securely locked. How is he even getting in?" The scene now changed to a woman who looked like she may have been a neighbor or family friend. "They were a very nice bunch of people," she said. "The parents had great jobs, the kids got outstanding marks on all of their tests at school, and the poor little one," she sniffed, fighting back tears. "He was only a baby. He had barely even learned to speak in full sentences." "Can you think if they had any enemies or debts they failed to pay off?" said a reporter to the sobbing woman. "No," she replied, hiccuping. "They were great with their finances. No one in the neighborhood hated them. I can't see anyone in their right mind hating a family like that." She sniffed again. "I would always hear them laughing at mealtimes. I can't tell you how horrified I was to hear them screaming." The scene returned to the anchor woman. Mysterious murders, and the police forces have no leads or suspects. We urge everyone to add extra protection to their homes, for it is apparent that no house is safe from this maniac. We wish you all safety. And now the weather. Koto looked at Mina, who was stirring her soup absent-mindedly, her expression blank. "Are you all right?" he whispered. Mina put her hands in her face, letting out a series of light sobs. "What are the police doing?" she cried. "No leads? No suspects?" She lifted her face to look at Koto, her mascara running. "For 3 years? Not one person has witnessed anybody strange? It doesn't seem normal. And those poor children." She sobbed more. Koto bit his thumb, looking into his nearly empty soup bowl. "Don't be weak," he thought desperately. "You can't tell anyone."